Hello everyone, welcome to the Clinic Kids Autism Seminar Series. We're really glad to have you here. Thanks for coming. Let's get started. Okay, so our topic for today for the Clinic Kids Autism Seminar Series is Beyond Survival, Supporting Autistic Children to Thrive in School. But before we get into it, we need to do our acknowledgement. So we want to acknowledge that the Clinic Kids Research Institute Australia acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the land and waters of Australia. We also acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk, Yarrawurrung, Kauriyani and Karuna elders. These people and their land upon which the Institute is located and seek their wisdom in our work to improve the health and development of children.
So, hi, I'm Marisa Di Lorenzo. I'm one of the senior speech pathologists at Clinic Kids, that's part of the Kids Research Institute in Australia. I trained and worked as a speech pathologist in London, you might hear from my accent, before moving to Perth in 2011. In London, I had a range of roles, one of which involved working as part of an autism outreach team for schools, providing training and support for staff. I've been living in Perth and working in the disability sector here for 13 years now. And in that time, I've worked across mainstream schools, ed support centres and ed support schools. I am really passionate about collaborating together with families and school staff because I really believe that together we can have a much bigger and more positive impact on the educational outcomes and well-being of the autistic children that we support.
Awesome. I'm feeling very lucky to be here with Marisa. I'm Sarah Pillar. I am the Research Development Manager here at Clinic Kids here at the Kids Research Institute Australia. I'm a speech pathologist by background, but I've been working in the area of autism for the last 10 years, but I'm currently within a research role. I have a passion for supporting autistic children and their families using evidence-based practice. Part of that equation is doing what we can to support autistic children to develop their individual strengths and skills before they get to school. But a big part of that equation is also making sure that the school environment and teachers are really well set up and supported to provide the best learning environment for autistic students once they get to school. I've spent a lot of time in schools, including in our regional schools in the wonderful Wheatbelt and Great Southern regions here in WA. So I'm really excited about talking about supporting autistic students to thrive in school today.
Okay, so we want to acknowledge community preferences for both person first and identity first language, but tonight we're going to be primarily using identity first language, so autistic person or autistic child, to reflect the preference of the majority of autistic adults. But we acknowledge the right of children to emerge into their identities over time. We also want to recognise those watching who have lived experience of autism, as well as those who love and care for autistic people. Our work would not be possible without your generosity in contributing to our research, as well as your valued input into the supports that we offer here at Clinic Kids.
Okay, so before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. So this main original portion of the seminar is all us presenting to you, but we also have a part of it that is going to be a Q&A. So you can ask questions through the Q&A button in MS Teams, and we'll be answering as many as we can at the end of the presentation today. We also just wanted to note that a recording will be available for a set period of time after the presentation as well. So with all of that out of the way, we want to talk about Beyond Survival, supporting autistic children to thrive in school. So why this topic? So as a team and also as individuals, we are asked so many questions when it comes to autistic children in schools. Questions like, which school should I send my child to? Or where can I go for information I can trust? Or how do I support autistic kids in my class? And what can I do to help my child cope at school? My child is refusing to go to school. What do I do? Some of these questions reveal a lot of worries that parents and teachers have about supporting autistic children at school. These common questions give us a clue that autistic children are not always thriving at school, that teachers, parents, and students are sometimes just surviving day to day. And that is not the vision we have for autistic students in schools. At the heart of these questions is a shared desire for all kids to have the opportunity to thrive in school, which is part of our broader vision for happy and healthy autistic children. No parent wants to worry as they drop their kids at the school gates or see tears in the car on the way home. No teacher wants to see children excluded from activities or distressed in the classroom. I want to acknowledge that in this space, it can sometimes feel like parents and teachers are pitted against each other, but we want to start this conversation off with the reflection that parents and teachers very much want the same thing for kids, for them to be happy, healthy, and thriving at school. And in this seminar, we want to share some information based on both research evidence, but also clinical practice experience about some of the keys to make that happen for autistic children. So how are we going to tackle this topic? So first, we're going to begin by setting the scene. Here we'll outline some of the characteristics, strengths, and challenges of autistic children and how these impact on their school experience. We're also going to outline some of the characteristics, strengths, and challenges of schools themselves and how these might be barriers or facilitators to the school experience of autistic children. Second, we're going to highlight 4 key areas to focus on for improving the school experience for autistic children. We've chosen 4 key things that you as a parent, a teacher, or a community clinician can help to make sure we are getting right for kids to make the biggest impact possible on their outcomes at school. And then finally, we are going to spend a brief time reimagining the future of education, just a little. Talk about the spaces we see, are excited to see shifting now and into the future. So that's what we're going to cover. Our goal is that the information will be really practical and that if you are a parent, teacher, education assistant, or school leader, you'll be able to walk away with at least one tangible thing that you could implement tomorrow to make the educational experience of a child that bit better. So let's get started. Let's set the scene. So what are some of the common characteristics of autistic students and some of the common characteristics of schools? Characteristics aren't things that are necessarily good or bad. They're just factors we should be able to consider in this conversation. So first up, we have some social differences. So one of the common characteristics of autistic students is that they have differences in social interaction and relating with others. We also might see some communication differences. They may communicate in ways that are unexpected for the neurotypical population. Autistic students also might have a preference for predictability and repetition and different experiences around changes in their routine and transitions between tasks. Autistic students also commonly have specialised or focused interests. They might have keen interests in particular topics, sometimes to the exclusion of other topics. We also see sensory differences, so differences in how they experience and have needs for sensory stimulation. And we also might see a particular strength with the concrete or direct, so differences in their experiences of how they interpret indirect or implied communication. But how does that relate to some of the common characteristics that we see in schools? So in contrast, in schools where autistic children might have social differences, schools have really high social expectations that children will play, interact, and relate in quite expected ways. There's also very high communication expectations in schools that children will often speak verbally and communicate in these kind of expected ways. Schools have really high expectations when it comes to children being flexible and adaptable throughout the day, and also that there's this expectation that children will be engaged and interested in a variety of subjects and activities. There's sensory expectations built into the classroom in schools that children will experience and manage sensory stimuli in the same way. And finally, there's lots of implied communication in schools that children are expected to pick up on the implied communication, that they might imitate others and just kind of know what to do, and less of that concrete and direct communication. So as you can see, there's a bit of a mismatch between the common characteristics and expectations of autistic students and the common characteristics and expectations of schools. Some autistic students do incredibly well at school, but certainly for some students, there's a big mismatch, and this can create a bit of friction. For a long time, autistic students were put under enormous pressure to change and to cope with the characteristics and expectations of schools. The expectation was very much put on the autistic child to either manage the mainstream or be educated elsewhere. In more recent years, there's been a strong trend towards encompassing students students with diverse abilities and characteristics in mainstream classrooms. And there has been a cultural shift within the disability advocacy space to making sure that the first consideration is not about changing the child, but how we can change the environment around the child to support them to be included. We know that based on the Disability Discrimination Act and disability standards for education, teachers and school leaders have a responsibility to reasonably support all students to access and participate in education to reach their full potential. This may require reasonable adjustments to curriculum, teaching, or the learning environment in collaboration with students and their parents. So now that we've set that scene, let's move on to what can we practically do? Let's talk about some of those really practical and reasonable adjustments and what they can look like in practice. So we are going to highlight 4 key areas to focus on for improving the school experience for autistic children. And we've chosen 4 key things that we see implemented in schools, so we know that they're possible to do, which can make a big impact on that autistic child's outcome at school.
Okay, so what are these 4 key areas for support? So we have identified identity and culture as one, activity supports, sensory supports, and finally social and communication supports. So if we can provide the right supports in these 4 areas, then children are much more likely to thrive at school. So let's start thinking first about identity and culture. What do we mean by identity? What is it? What is this identity and culture? So if we think about identity first, identity refers to an individual's sense of self and how they perceive themselves in relation to those around them. So for example, I am female and I am English/Italian/Australian, and I'm a speech pathologist. A person's identity begins to develop in childhood, but of course it continues to develop through our lives. So moving on to self-concept, this is our view of who we are and our abilities. So for example, I am caring, I'm creative, I'm hardworking. And a positive self-concept is having beliefs about yourself that help you cope successfully with events in your own life, as well as having a positive impact on the lives of others. And finally, culture. Culture refers to the shared values, beliefs and practices and norms of a group of people. So for example, here at the Kids Institute, we are united in this shared vision of happy, healthy kids. And so our culture is made up of beliefs and behaviours that uphold that vision. So why are these things important when thinking about autistic children in school? All 3 of these concepts are interconnected, and it's of huge importance for children's well-being that they develop a strong sense of identity and a positive self-concept, and this is significantly impacted by the culture around them. The culture, which is attitudes and the beliefs and words of people around the child, can have a really significant impact on a child's developing sense of self.
So when a child is developing differently and there's some baked in friction between who they are and how their brain works, but then also the school system, they can explicitly or implicitly be exposed to negative messages about not just what they do, but who they are. And that's not what we want for autistic children. Just like every other child, autistic children deserve the chance to go to school where it's okay to be themselves. I think this is one we can all agree on. Kids want this, parents want this, and teachers want this. This is a particularly important thing to get right for all kids, but especially for autistic children, because there is a much higher rate of mental health problems in the autistic population, and current research reports that around 70% of autistic people experience mental health problems, which is up to 4 times higher than the general population. And we know a child's positive self-concept is of huge importance because it can impact on their development of meaningful relationships, their sense of belonging, and positively impact on their mental health outcomes. Of course, the wider media that the child is exposed to and the representation that they see in stories have a part to play with our child's experience of culture. But the research tells us that the most important parts of culture that influence how a child develops a positive self-concept is about the people that they actually see every day. and how those people that they interact with every day in that bubble immediately around them, so their family, their parents, their friends, the community that they have at school, they play this really important role. Schools and the school community have a vital role to play in each child's developing self-concept and identity, and so schools have an essential role in creating a culture that is safe and accepting for autistic children. And that's where we talk about this concept of being neurodiversity affirming. But what do we mean by that? So neurodiversity is that the idea that there are lots of different kinds of brain, and variations based in the brain, like those differences we see in autism, but other conditions like ADHD, are natural variations in the human brain. Being neurodiversity affirming is about valuing all types of brains and the people who have them equally. So a school who's creating a neurodiversity affirming culture in their school would have messages like, having a different kind of brain is okay and celebrated here. They'd say, you are understood, your experience and perspective is valued, and we see you as a whole, not just your strengths, not just your needs, and not just your challenges. Marisa, what are some of the challenges we might see for kids at schools if their school is not neurodiversity affirming?
Yeah, so if positive or autistic identity and culture are missing in your school, you might see or feel some of the following things. So teachers and school leaders might not feel equipped to talk about neurodiversity. They might not have had the training in it. They might not have the knowledge or the resources to know where to start that conversation. Teachers might feel constrained by the systemic limitations, so trying to balance the child's needs with the demands of their jobs within the limited time and resources available. We might see children in the classroom who don't feel safe to be their authentic selves. They might suppress or hide their real thoughts and feelings for fear of standing out or saying or doing the wrong thing. And we might see children who are not happy to come to school and who feel like they don't belong. So what can we do to help? Sarah, can you share some ideas with us?
So your school might already be somewhere on this journey to embracing a school-wide culture of being neurodiversity affirming. Cultural change can take time, but individual teachers and school staff in moment-by-moment interactions can make a big difference. Some suggestions to consider are, it's important that staff school-wide are trained in using a neurodiversity affirming approach, not just classroom teachers. School culture is about everyone, from the administration desk to the school gate to the principal's office. Strong culture is woven throughout a context. To make a neurodiversity affirming approach part of the culture, it's got to be everybody's business. A simple but practical way to incorporate a neurodiversity affirming approach in the classroom is to talk about differences in a neutral or positive way. We can have open conversations about differences in our classrooms, that we all have different brains, different learning preferences, different communication styles, and different strengths and challenges as well. All students should be clear that there's not one ideal way to be, and that being themselves is okay. We know from the research that teachers have a particularly important leadership role to play in the classroom in modelling respectful interactions with students with disabilities, and that how teachers talk about students with additional needs can significantly influence how non-disabled classroom peers interact with those students with disabilities. In this area, teachers have a lot of power in fostering an inclusive classroom environment. And finally, we can validate the skills, interests, and ideas of autistic students in our classroom, recognising a student's great attention to detail or their knowledge on their special interest can help to affirm their identity. Marisa, you've seen some great examples of neurodiversity affirming approach being incorporated into schools. Tell us about where you've seen this in action.
So I wanted to share like a recent example of a parent who was looking for a primary school for her child. And she came across a school that presented as very inclusive and actively welcomed neurodivergent children. The mum described attending an open day at the school where she was shown around by one of the students who was neurodivergent themselves. And the student was able to speak firsthand to her about her positive experience and the school's inclusive culture. When I looked at the school's website, it talked about community and belonging, and celebrating difference of all community members, from students to staff and families. And the principal's message said, which is the quote on the screen, "Through exploring, sharing and respecting each other's differences, we grow, learn and discover more about the world and ourselves." And I really liked this because I liked the idea of community and about these children having positive role models who had themselves like a positive autistic identity. And it's wonderful to have like these values of inclusivity in a school. But you know that there is a true inclusive culture when the students themselves are able to articulate and demonstrate this to others. So if we want to provide our autistic students the best start in life, we really need to begin with providing them with a positive autistic identity and culture. And this can start with us. So thinking about our own words, our own actions, and the message that we want to send our students and the community. So we've spoken about identity and culture, so we're going to next think about activity support. So Sarah, please tell us, what do we mean by activity supports?
So in the building industry, when we are building something new, we use scaffolding around the building to support the building process and help builders access materials and build. So too, when we're supporting children to learn something new, they might need scaffolding in place to support them to be successful. We've talked already about how parents and teachers both want children to be successful in school, but children themselves really want to be successful too. When we see a child struggling, our first thought should be what support needs were unmet, or what scaffolding did this child need to be successful that they don't currently have. Scaffolding can take many forms, but two of the main kinds of scaffolding are environmental scaffolding and also interpersonal scaffolding. So what do we mean by that? Environmental scaffolding is when we have things in the environment that provide supports. Often these are visual cues. When I really need to remember to take my sneakers to work the next day, I might leave them by my front door to remind me to bring them. That's an example of an environmental scaffold. Interpersonal scaffolds are supports provided by other people. So in my example, if I really wanted to remember to take my sneakers to work the next day, I might ask my husband, can you please remind me? He would be providing an interpersonal scaffold. Activity supports or activity scaffolds are supports that help a child to participate in daily activities. By providing these supports, we increase the child's chances of success, help the child to feel safe during learning, and support the child to stay regulated when doing something challenging or new. Marisa, what might a need for activity supports look like in the classroom?
Yeah, so activity supports help children to understand and carry out tasks, to retain instructions and to be able to ask for help when it's needed. So where a child has difficulty with one or more of these, or where there's a mismatch between the task and the child's capabilities, you might see some of the following things in a classroom. So you might see the child disengaging from tasks, or you might see dysregulation, so feelings of overwhelm, frustration, and anxiety that may present outwardly in different ways for different children. You might see them being disruptive to others in the class, or you might see them having difficulty starting a task. They might be the kind of child that you need to prompt them each time, step by step, even with like a routine activity such as writing their name at the top of the worksheet. You might also see a child who is not asking for help or a break when they need it. Some children may withdraw rather than ask for a break, and some children may engage in behaviours that are maybe distracting to others in an attempt to regulate themselves or avoid the task. As you can see, needing greater support to engage in activities can come out in lots of different ways and behaviours. But there are lots of simple strategies we can use to support children to participate better and to be more independent in tasks. And Sarah is going to share some of these with us.
So two types of activity supports that are really effective for supporting autistic learners are creating consistent and predictable routines and also providing visual supports. So we know that autistic learners can have a strong preference for predictability within routines, and you can build predictable routines by doing the same activity in the same way each time, for example, in the same steps, in the same order, using the same instructions. So an example routine that you might have is at the start of the day. We know arriving at school can be a big transition for children, so having a predictable routine can be a great way to support an autistic student with that transition. Autistic people tell us that routines can help make them feel safe and comfortable in those spaces. A morning routine can help students to start off the day on a positive note, but routines can be used throughout the day to support autistic students. So we would call this an interpersonal support because it's usually supported by a teacher, and that teacher has a key role in planning, implementing and sustaining the routine. But over time, students can become more active in advocating for the routines that would help them. Next, let's talk about visual supports. So visual supports is another kind of support which are easy and quick to implement. A visual support can be bullet points on a whiteboard, a drawing on a scrap of paper, visual schedule or a sequence. It does not need to be fancy or laminated. Visual supports provide clear breakdowns of the steps in a task. They support with knowing the expectations, what's coming next, and they might also provide an alternative to verbally participating if this is not possible for the child. Marisa, where have you seen this used successfully?
So one example comes to mind of a child who was refusing to go to his music lessons each week. He would throw himself on the floor and not listen or follow any instructions from his teachers. But he was a child who loved music lessons the previous term, so staff were really perplexed about what had changed. After some discussion as a team, we decided to trial some of the following activity supports. So the first thing was using a visual schedule to prepare him for the transition to his music lesson, giving him ample time and preparation, keeping that transition really consistent and predictable. And once in the music room, letting him sit in a quiet spot at the back of the class, as this seemed to be his safe space and where he was most regulated. We then thought about minimising the demands on him, so not giving him instructions or asking questions and using the least amount of language possible, but also like having the activity that the other children were doing in his vicinity so that he could see it and that he could choose to access it and participate when he was ready. We also thought about modelling asking for a break using a visual tool when we could see that he could maybe benefit from one. So these supports were fairly simple. They didn't require lots of preparation, just a bit of thought as a team, but actually they had a really big impact very quickly. So a mixture of these interpersonal supports from staff, which was like providing the predictability in the routine and minimising language, as well as these environmental supports through supporting comprehension and regulation and advocating for his own needs, meant that this student was able to participate really fully in the music lesson, which was a really great outcome.
That's a great example.
So we're now moving on to sensory supports, and Sarah is going to talk us through what some of these sensory differences are.
Awesome. So a common core characteristic of many autistic children is that they experience sensory input in a different way. The research tells us that at around 63% of autistic children show significant sensory differences at the time of their diagnosis, but of course these can vary across the lifespan. The way that a child might be experiencing sensory input might be amplified, so they might feel something more than others, or their sensory experience might also be reduced, so they might feel something less than others. These differences can be across many different sensory areas, including vision, sound, taste, smell, all the ones that we've listed there. A child might also have different experiences across different sensory domains. So a child might have a strong response or experience in one area while having a reduced response or experience in another. Some examples of some sensory differences might include That sensation of knowing when you're hungry or thirsty or the need to go to the toilet, or having a strong response to lights, sounds, or textures. Marisa, what are some sensory challenges at school and what can they look like?
So, as we know, schools have a lot of sensory information to process. They are busy, noisy, hectic environments with lots going on. And so, you know, it can be really overwhelming for children who have sensory differences. And what does this look like? So I guess the first thing is dysregulation, and that can look different for different children. You might see emotional outbursts, you might see avoidance of the thing that's causing the discomfort. So if it's noise, covering ears or moving away from a noisy environment. You might see removal of the thing that's causing discomfort. So if it's clothing that feels yuck, then you might see a child removing clothing. You might see increased movement, so a child rocking back and forth in their chair or moving around the classroom when everyone else is sitting. You might see distractibility, so difficulty with taking in information and following instructions when experiencing sensory overload. Whereas some students you might see withdraw, they might be unresponsive, they might even kind of go into shutdown. But then you might see others who suppress their dysregulation at school. They hide what they're sort of feeling and going through. And so you might not see anything at school, but then they let it out later when they're at home. So there's lots of different ways we might see sensory challenges at school, but there are lots of simple things we can do to support sensory differences in the school environment.
So it's important in each case to start with the individual. Sensory needs are often unique to the individual and they can change over time as well. If the student themselves can tell you about their own strengths, needs and preferences, that's a really great place to start. Next, we often talk about how doing an audit of the environment, reviewing what stimuli might be happening, when and how this might be impacting on the student. Then based on that audit, seeing if there are any adaptations we can implement. So focus on what we can change in the environment as a first point of call. This might include adding sound dampening panels to reduce echo or lowering the volume on school bells. It could also be managing classroom clutter and providing clear, organised spaces that can reduce visual overload. Finally, we then look at providing tools and teaching strategies for the child, offering calming or alerting breaks, equipment like headphones to manage sound, or teaching coping skills for managing sensory experiences, like giving a child a warning before the bell goes off. Things like that can really help a child manage. Marisa, where have you seen this done really well?
Yeah, so I think a common example is children during lessons such as an art lesson where there's lots of different kind of sensory elements. So many children who are hypersensitive to wet, sticky textures find art really challenging. So this child that I'm thinking of didn't like the feel of getting glue and paint on his hands, and he hated the feel of the stiff apron against his body. So his teachers considered the sensory elements of the lesson that were causing him the most discomfort, and they came up with some alternatives instead. So, for example, they switched his apron and provided him with a soft apron that felt much more comfortable for him. They provided him with a cloth so that if he got anything on his hands, he was able to wipe them. And they provided him with a way to ask for a break if he needed one. So if he was feeling a bit overwhelmed, he had a way to ask for a break, and this was modelled to him by his teachers. So these simple strategies enabled this child to feel validated and safe and to engage in the art lesson with his peers. I think the key was to consider his individual needs, put in place some environmental supports, and provide him with a way to advocate for his needs when he needed a break. So we have got to our final key area of social communication support. So Sarah, please outline for us what do we mean by social communication skills?
So social communication skills are really important consideration in schools. Schools are busy and dynamic social environments, and autistic students have some differences in how they interact and communicate, which can leave them at significant risk of isolation and bullying at school. Recess and lunch in particular can be a challenge for autistic students. When most children are getting a genuine break in their day, recess and lunch can be the time during the day when autistic children are working their hardest, trying to interact with peers that might not understand them well, decoding the unspoken rules of social interaction, and using their communication system to express their wants, needs, and ideas. So thinking about the social communication demands on autistic children is really important for the school experience of autistic children. Marisa, what can it look like when social and communication skills are a bit of a challenge at school?
Yeah, so communication is used across all aspects of the school day, and so the impact of social and communication challenges can be really significant. And a few ways that you might see some of the challenges at school are frequent miscommunications, where there's a mismatch or a misunderstanding between a neurotypical and autistic communication style. So for instance, neurotypical peers may misinterpret the autistic child's honest and direct communication style as being rude, whereas the autistic child who has a preference for more literal and clear communication may be confused by the peers who are using more non-literal communication to, for example, to tease or to joke. You also might see for children who present with communication delays or who use augmentative alternative communication, so by that we mean alternative means such as pictures or a voice output device, they might become frustrated if they can't get their message across or if they don't understand what's being communicated to them. And you might also see a child feel isolated when they don't know how to connect with peers and build relationships. As with our other key areas, we can make a really big difference when we take an individual approach, considering each child's communication preferences, strengths, and their needs. Sarah, can you tell us a bit some of the effective supports that we can be using?
Yep, great. So we've highlighted 3 key strategies to support social communication success at school. So number 1, using a total communication approach where we accept and encourage all forms of communication and model these ourselves. Autistic students might communicate in a variety of ways. This might be verbally speaking, pointing to pictures, hand leading you to things that they want to show you. It's important that we attune to all of these methods. The goal is to prioritize the child's communication, no matter what form it takes. Becoming a really good listener and observer can make a huge difference to the success of communication for autistic students. Number 2, using clear and explicit language to explain activities, their purpose and their structure. So an instruction like, I want you to turn to your partner and discuss topic X. What does having a discussion about a topic mean? That for an autistic learner, you might need to provide more clear instructions about what does a discussion look like? What are the key elements? What does that mean that you are expecting the child to do? So supporting autistic children with this direct language and explicit instruction is really helpful. And finally, number 3, supporting different ways of being social. Not having the expectation that students have to be social in the same way. So supporting autistic children at lunchtime with lunch clubs where they can engage in their interests, like a Lego club or a chess club, can really help make sure that an autistic child doesn't flounder at lunchtime, but they are supported to engage socially in a more structured and predictable way that might suit their needs. Marisa, where have you seen this implemented really well?
Yeah. So one example that comes to mind is for a child where there were lots of communication breakdowns happening across the day, and teachers and education staff were unsure how to respond to his delayed echolalia, which are chunks of language that were taken in this instance from favourites and TV programmes. He didn't always respond to instructions or answer questions, and staff felt at a loss as to how they could increase his participation in class. And at recess and breaks, he often played alone, and staff were unsure how to facilitate peer friendships. So we worked together to better understand this child's communication strengths, interests and needs, so we could provide the right supports. Staff began by responding to his echolalia as meaningful communication by acknowledging what he said or repeating back his words. Instead of asking questions to try and get some verbal responses from this child, they modelled words and phrases for him. And they looked at the sort of play that he was interested in, and they encouraged play with children who had like-minded interests. And so what staff noticed when they did all of these things is that the child was actually more likely to continue the interaction with them when they responded to his echolalia. It often led to more back and forth because he felt kind of understood and validated. Equally, when they stopped asking questions, which tended to shut down the interaction, and they instead used more comments, it would often lead to the child adding more words to keep the conversation going. And by scaffolding shared interest with peers, this child found ways to connect with his classmates that were meaningful to him. So by accepting all forms of communication, using language that was at the child's level, and supporting other ways of being social, he was able to communicate and connect more effectively with teachers and peers.
Such a nice example. Okay, so those are our 4 key areas to support. So identity and culture, activity supports, sensory supports, and social communication. But how are these connected? So the strategies that we have across all of these areas are all at the heart of them about regulation. Regulation really forms the foundation that we can build education on top of. So regulation is that core skill that it makes us ready to learn and supports us. And all the key theme across all of these different strategies in different areas is about supporting that child's regulation so that they're ready to learn, ready to be a part of that education.
So, whilst there are some simple things that you can do as a teacher to help autistic children thrive in school, the responsibility shouldn't be all on teachers or schools, and we want to acknowledge that there are challenges in the broader education system that can make supporting autistic children in schools more difficult. We want to briefly explore some of the things that make it challenging for schools and teachers, but we also want to explore the huge potential for reimagining the future of education. These are 3 areas that we want to explore today for reinvention: built environment, teacher training, and resources. Sarah, can you start us off by talking about the built environment?
Yeah, great. So the environment in schools is based on really quite an old model. They've been quite consistent for the last 30 or 40 years in many schools. And we know that that built environment is not well fit for autistic learners. It's really great to see that there's been some increased recognition of sensory needs. I've been delighted to walk into some schools and see signs to the inclusion of a sensory room. But in the same way that we include ramps for wheelchair users, hearing loop systems for deaf children, the future of education needs to consider the built environment more broadly for autistic children and accommodating spaces that support the sensory engagement of autistic students. So considerations like dimmable lights, quiet spaces, crash and bang spaces for movement during the day, so that then autistic students can be able to have that better access to inclusion.
So teacher training, we know that providing teachers with the skills and training required for their roles is imperative. But we also know from what newly qualified teachers tell us is that they often start the job having received little to no training on how to support autistic students. And a lot of their learning is on the job. We also know that the evidence around best practice is growing and changing all of the time. So ongoing support and training is also really important for even experienced teachers. In a reimagined education system, training modules on supporting neurodivergent students will be embedded into teacher training, and schools and teachers will have regular and easy access to ongoing high-quality evidence-based training and resources so that they feel confident and equipped to support all the children in their class. So lastly, we'll move on to
resources. Awesome. I want to preface this section by saying education assistants and teachers assistants are incredible. I've worked with some amazing EAs who are true heroes and who have made an enormous difference in the lives of children. We know that there is a really strong focus from both parents and teachers, often in advocating for that one-on-one support from an EA in a classroom. And while we know that in some circumstances that this approach can make a world of difference, we also know from the research evidence that sometimes, surprisingly, this can actually have sometimes a negative impact on the true inclusion of a child in a classroom. It can result in a child having reduced direct contact with their primary teacher. And sometimes it can also be linked in the research with the child having reduced peer interactions or being taught separately, kind of taught off to the side in a classroom. This is an area which could benefit from some reimagining. What's the best use of our resources so that we don't support children in isolated islands in the classroom C, but change the landscape? This might look like overall reduced class sizes, using a co-teaching approach, or many other ways of rethinking classroom resources, but certainly a space for us to rethink and reimagine. I just want to wrap up this section by thinking about that I feel like there's been a lot of momentum building in this area and change is on the agenda. We acknowledge it's not all up to teachers and parents and that systems have responsibility, but it's been great to see things like the parliamentary inquiry into supporting autistic learners and a different kind of brilliance report that has come out and I see some of the momentum building in this space for addressing some of these things around resourcing, teacher training, and that built environment. So we've gone through setting the scene, autistic kids in schools, these 4 key areas for getting it right, and then also this brief look at reimagining the future of education. We're going to link some resources along with our presentation, but we've made really good time. So before we go into questions, I'm just going to sprig that we have to look out for our next seminar. So our next seminar is going to be in November, and that is going to be focused on